welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Audrey Lichter, and I'm the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah sponsors the Scholars Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning, social action, and spiritual and ritual development. The Scholars Circle hosts lectures from prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community. It is geared to those of us, rabbis, educators, and lay leaders, who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a source sheet that will be sent to you after each lecture and be recorded and accessible via our website and shared with you through email. Before I introduce Scott Shay, a couple of housekeeping items. To send questions, please use the question and answer button on Zoom. Q&A will be held approximately 45 minutes into the lecture. We welcome questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email shortly and will be available at chaimitzvah.org. Nina Walden will be taking questions at the end of our session. Now something about Scott. Scott A. Shay, Chai Mitzvah's board president and a businessman, thought leader, and author of 3 books. Scott's most recent book, Conspiracy U, a Case Study, challenges the proliferation of anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist conspiracy theories championed on college campuses from the far right and the far left. His second book, In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism, explores the most common critiques of monotheism and incorporates Jewish, Christian, and Muslim voices. Scott has been a longtime Jewish activist and has served on the boards of local, national, and international Jewish organizations. Scott has been very active on college campuses and high schools, educating students and alumni about the impact of anti-Zionist conspiracy theories. He is taking his message into the business world as well. For more information about Scott can be found on his website at scottshay.com or contact info@scottshay.com. Now, Scott.
Audrey, thank you. Thank you for that generous introduction. I appreciate it. We're going to talk about a topic that is unfortunately extraordinarily timely. I wrote the book Conspiracy U mostly during 2020, and it was published and released in 2021. And unfortunately, a number of the items that I talked about in Conspiracy U broadly and sadly came to fruition. I had written about how ideas like from the river to the sea, as we see in protest, and that's slide 9, as we see that proliferating on campuses, and why it suddenly has become such a rallying cry. I talked about, and this is slide 8, why academics would talk about terms by any means necessary, knowing exactly what that means: slaughter Jews. How did this all happen? And I focused on my campus, slide 6, the bucolic and beautiful Northwestern University, which is a place that frankly was not historically known. As a matter of fact, we have a nice shot of it in slide 6. It says not historically been considered a very politically active campus. Yet now, American Alumni for Campus Fairness, ADL, and others are threatening to lawsuit against it. And Jewish students at Northwestern consistently report not feeling safe. A BDS resolution passed with the vote of something like 20-2. So we have a new environment, unfortunately, where students are being indoctrinated. But I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think that the core of it is more than that, because it's, how did this happen on campus? How did conspiracy theories about Jews come to be viewed as academic theories, which have a much higher standard. We know what academic theories are supposed to be, and they're clearly not supposed to be conspiracy theories. So let's roll back a little bit and talk about what is a conspiracy theory. And this is an important point. And if you take one major takeaway from this lecture, from this part of the program, it should be this, because this will serve you in all sorts of other areas as well, which is that a conspiracy theory is a set of unrelated facts and sometimes lies that are linked together, even though they don't have linkages, to create a unfalsifiable construct of reality. Now, what do I mean by all of that? And here's one more important fact about a conspiracy theory, one more characteristic, not fact, characteristic of the conspiracy theory. Frequently, the people who create the conspiracy theory know it's not true. They know it's a lie, but they do it for politically or ideologically motivated reasons. So let's unpack all of that, and let's unpack all of that. And let's take maybe some examples. Let's take the Sandy Hook conspiracy theory. Sandy Hook, the Sandy Hook Elementary School, unfortunately suffered a decimating attack with about 30 kindergartners and first graders murdered, teachers murdered, and then ultimately the assailant murdered his mother and ultimately committed suicide. Now, there is a whole series of conspiracy theories that grew up around that, and they were coined by, among others, Alex Jones. And this theory had many of the characteristics of a conspiracy theory. First, it was unfalsifiable. What does it mean to be unfalsifiable? Any countervailing fact or evidence, suddenly the conspiracy theory surrounds it. So, for example, the fact that there were all these unfortunately dead bodies. Well, those, according to Alex Jones, they were just actors. And what about the teachers and the like? Well, they didn't really exist if it was his own birtherism, and so on and so on. No fact could actually contradict the Sandy Hook conspiracy theory, because whatever fact anyone brought was surrounded by, was encompassed, or the conspiracy theory grew. And Alex Jones, ultimately in court, affirmed that he didn't believe the conspiracy theory either. He created it, but had no real belief in it. Why did he do it? He did it because he opposed gun control. Now, whether or not you oppose gun control or are in favor of gun control, you shouldn't be making stuff up. And by the way, causing a lot of pain to the parents, siblings, and the entire Sandy Hook community. So let's go now, shift focus to Northwestern. And I'm going to talk about a person, Arthur Butts, slide 4. And Arthur Butts is a professor of engineering at Northwestern University, who became a tenured professor. And actually, Mr. Butts, Professor Butts, whatever you want to call him, he really created an amazing algorithm that substantially increased computing power and advanced the time that all you, me, everybody on this seminar would be able to use a system like the computer we're working on. This was his system was invented. His algorithm he came up with in the early 70s, and it was really so substantial that it was named, although they don't use it anymore, mostly because I think of his other activities. But it was called the Butts algorithm, and he rightly received tenure as soon as he was up for it at Northwestern. Then he took a sabbatical year, and he wrote a book called The Hoax of the 20th Century, which argued that the whole Holocaust really didn't happen. Yes, there might have been a little bit of a diphtheria and typhoid outbreak, and some Jews might have died accidentally because of that, but there was no real Holocaust. Yes, Adolf Hitler could have used his words more carefully, but he was a politician, so he exaggerated. And actually, what happened was Hitler and the Germans protected the Jews and put them into security camps for their own protection. And it was only the Russians who actually caused any harm to the Jews. That this was all just really trumped up by the Zionists, the Jews. And what about all those tens of thousands of documents that portray the execution of the Holocaust as it was happening? What about the minutes of the Wannsee conference, where the final solution was actually detailed and outlined, and then they had lunch? Well, that was all forged by the Jews, the Zionists. It didn't really happen. And what about the demographic tables that showed that the shrinkage of 6 million Jews in Europe? Well, that didn't really happen. There were some minor discrepancies that he finds in the tables, and therefore he throws all of that evidence out, even though they're very minor and within the normal range of demographic surveys, particularly at the time frame. He says, because there are differences, all of those need to be thrown out. Again, disparate facts, as I talked about before, trying to connect dots that can't be connected. And what about when he's confronted with Germans and others who confessed to committing crimes against humanity? What about witnesses who talked about what they saw? What about perpetrators who weren't the bigwigs, who talked about what happened? What about victims? Well, in terms of the victims, they were just lying. They were Jews lying and their allies. And in terms of everyone else, he says the Zionist lawyers at the Nuremberg trials, of which there were very few, bamboozled and hypnotized poor, innocent, loving Nazis to confess to crimes against humanity that they would have never dreamed of actually committing. It was all any fact that comes up against Butts, his theories expand and they encompass those facts. And here's the other thing about conspiracy theories, and Butts is certainly part of them. He's part of the whole Institute for Historical Revision, which is obsessively focused on the Holocaust and saying it didn't exist. And others, is that they all believe, those people who are taken in by a conspiracy theory all believe that they have a secret knowledge, a knowledge that other people don't have, a knowledge that other people outside of that circle don't have and can have, because they don't want to understand or agree to this strange conflation of facts. And that's why it's so hard to get someone out of a conspiracy theory, because A, you believe you have a secret knowledge. You generally, there's someone who's making this stuff up, who is using it to manipulate people, because there's no greater way to manipulate. I talk about this in my book, Conspiracy U, to manipulate people than through a conspiracy theory. Once you've got someone locked into a conspiracy theory, it's very hard to get them out of it. Even after Alex Jones said that the Sandy Hook massacre happened and wasn't a conspiracy, a false um, narration, people still believe that nothing happened at Sandy Hook. You can't get people out of it. QAnon, same thing. Very hard to get people out of it. Jonestown, where the leader convinced his followers to literally drink the Kool-Aid and give it first to their children. People become so captivated by the conspiracy theory that they really can't get out. And they become obsessive about it because it becomes the important thing in one's life. And in the case of Jonestown, in one's death. Now, that's not typical that people commit suicide, but it does show you the power of conspiracy theories to hold on to people. I want to talk a little bit about, so people say, yeah, I get white supremacists, I get the conspiracy theories on the right, but what about on the left? Well, I showed you a couple of slides before, because similarly, conspiracy theories about Jews on the far left have become just as captivating to people as those on the far right. And unfortunately, they've taken over the university. Now, if you show the slide of Deering Meadow again in the library at Northwestern, I'll say that if you're facing that library and you turn left, you'll get to Arthur Butz's office. And if you turn right, you'll get to Stephen Thrasher's office. Now, Stephen Thrasher is a professor. He's a named professor at Northwestern in the Medill School of Journalism, which is supposed to, and he's a Daniel H. Renberg professor of social justice reporting. Now, journalism is all about getting the facts. But as I show in much more detail in the book, Stephen Thrasher aligns with conspiracy theories that he teaches. And you just showed the slide of the lecture hall. So here are folks in a lecture hall just taking it in, because people believe what their professors say. So when Professor Thrasher says that Israelis are gassing, and he wrote this, by the way, my book was written as I said, in 2020 and published in 2021. He wrote this before, that Israel has drones above Gaza gassing civilians, again, using Holocaust imagery. And they believe him. And he cites, and there's a professor by the name of Jasper Puar, who I talk about here, and he's a follower of folks like, and we can show Angela Davis, who is the sort of one of the lead proponents of conspiracy theories about Jews, and one of the central leaders. She wrote from Palestine to Ferguson, believing that everything is about Jews as hyper whites, teaching police around the world to oppress black and brown people. with no evidence, of course. And I've read all of not all, but I've read a lot of what Angela Davis has written. I've read a lot of what other people have written about the so-called deadly exchange. And there's nothing there. There's literally nothing there except imagination. Angela Brown talks about when she looks at Ferguson, she thinks of the oppression of the Palestinians and says that they're linked with no facts. And consistently, Professor Thrasher cites her as just her words. There's literally nothing behind them. And Jasper Puar, who writes that Jews in Israel are biohacking the DNA of Palestinians to systemically starve them. Again, taking this notion of startup nation and assuming that it's used, that somehow there's some magical malevolence that's used by Israelis. Again, with no evidence that there is organ harvesting. All those good Jews doing good deeds with those supposedly good Jews doing good deeds with providing medical care to Palestinians, Syrians coming over the border, etc. Well, they're organ harvesting. Since 1952 or 55, Israel has not prosecuted homosexuality at all. Well before it became an issue on campus. But now again, Professor Puar and others call this pinkwashing, that Israel is only doing this to virtue signal its liberal leftist credentials, even though this happened again way before. And the list really goes on and on of unbelievably malevolent ideas that are ascribed to Jews and to Israelis that actually don't make any sense. I mean, biohacking DNA to systemically starve people, like what? And she claimed that Professor Puar, again, a distinguished professor at Rutgers, claims that Israeli soldiers are taught to maim Palestinians so that they're not counted as dead. And by the way, this comes from another absurdity. She is surprised by the low number of Palestinians who have been killed at the hands of the Israelis. So there must be a reason, and the reason is that Israelis don't like having that number count, so they're just maiming. Again, trying to have theories surround facts. And indeed, it's interesting. She gave a talk at Vassar where she more or less, actually more than less, accedes to the fact that she's making it up. She says she turns the speculative into the now because it's important that there be a linkage to the violent resistance that's done by others that'll enable it. And we're seeing that on and on and on. We're seeing that now at the university, people are being taught these theories about Jews, and the thing that's difficult about them for me is just having someone who went to Northwestern. It means jettisoning scholarly standards. It means believing these things, writing books that are impenetrable and have no evidence, that just always cite each other. And this is all happening and taking over universities. It's taking over university presses. And it's not even, the frightening thing is not even that new. If you look at the Soviet encyclopedia, I cite this in the book, it's on page 21. Now, the thing we know since the fall of the Soviet Union is we now have minutes and we have notes of people who are writing the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. They knew they were making it up. And they wrote, the main posits of modern Zionism are militant chauvinism, racism, and anti-communism. The anti-human reactionary essence of Zionism is an overt and covert fight against the freedom movements, etc. International Zionist organizations own major financial funds, partly through Jewish monopolists and partly collected by Jewish mandatory charities. It also influences, controls significant parts of media agencies and outlets in the West. And Zionism serves as a front squad of colonialism and neocolonialism. They were way ahead of their day, and actively participates in the fight against national liberation movements of the peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So this is a communist creed. Duke University Press published a book by Stephen Saleta, in which he says in the problem with the remembrance of the Nazi Holocaust is that it happens in isolation of relevant historical events, and it's not useful at all given the corresponding genocide taking place as with the Palestinians at the hands of Israel. The Nazi Holocaust in Europe seems a direct antecedent to Israel's founding. There were plans from the outset of Zionism to rid the promised land of its indigenous people. So he rests his case on, it seems, on a multi-generational plot by Jews to rid the promised land, to rid Israel, to rid the Middle East of Jews. Makes it up. This is published by Duke University Press. And by the way, if you go to Duke University Press, there are like 15 pages of anti-Jewish, anti-Israel books, and one page that's like medieval Jewish philosophy. That's the only thing that can really be classified as not anti-Jewish. Jasper Poor's book, written by Duke University, published as well by Duke University Press. It won a distinguished book award. It was Book of the Year by the Women's Studies Association, and it has led her to great acclaim. I talked to one student who had been assigned her book in 2 different classes in the same semester. So made great strides. I quote also Stanford University Press, same sort of thing. And what you're finding in academia is that it is very, very hard for anyone to get accepted to graduate school, to certainly become a professor, if you have any pro-Israel aspects on your CV at all or in your history. I personally have talked to professors who have been passed over for tenure because they did the most tangential things that related to Israel, because they're totally evil, or they're ascribed as being totally evil. So when people talk about by any means necessary, if you're in this left or right conspiracy theory, where you believe Jews are so bad, so evil, that there's this cabal of coca, and I didn't mention this before with the conspiracy, that there's somehow this cabal of conspirators that is doing evil maliciously to the rest of the world, well, by any means necessary is okay, because if you want to, if you can wipe them out, wipe them out. And both the left and the right, the far left and the far right, have this messianic view that if only we could get rid of the Jews, then life would be better. On the far right, if only we could get rid of the Jews, then our utopian, intersectional, anti-capitalist view would take place, would be fine, we'd become a heaven on earth. And from the far right, if you go to Arthur Butts again, if only we can get rid of all of these fake whites, I mean, who are, in his view, polluting and harming and really hypnotizing good whites, then boy, if we just had this country ruled by whites, in his view, we'd be in great shape. So they both have a messianic view. Both sides have a messianic view of the world, and it's all encompassing. And so the stakes are very high. So you need to do whatever you do. And the far right didn't say by any means necessary, but they're pretty good at saying, don't replace us. We're going to kill the Jews. Um, and they are basically the replacement theory people as the far right. So we used to think that what happens on campus stays on campus. It's sort of like Las Vegas. But the answer to that is no more. What happens on campus doesn't stay on campus. Virtually everyone in the United States becoming part of the elites, becoming part of the media, becoming part of the government, becoming part of campaigns, has gone through college, and they've been indoctrinated because there is no other view. If you believe this evil about Zionists, if you believe that they perpetrated a hoax of the Holocaust and that's what the hoax of the 20th century says, to displace the Palestinians, to displace the indigenous people, to displace Arabs, even though Jews were indigenous to that area, and Palestinian, and actually the concept of Palestine is a much more modern concept. The Arabs conquered the Arab Empire conquered the land of Israel, but Jews were indigenous. But in his view, he throws that out and actually defends the Romans. He goes back so far as to defend the Romans. So I don't want to go off on a tangent here. I could, and I'm tempted to, but it becomes so important, and you're indoctrinated so intensely that once you get out, you can't believe anything differently. You're inside the conspiracy theory. So there's one corporation that I've spoken with, and from a DEI perspective, and here's the thing. A lot of the young people think Israel is terrible, are a little bit concerned about Jews, unless they say they're not Zionist. But they don't even know anybody who thinks Jews. They don't even know anybody who thinks Zionists are good people. And that's how you get to the point where recent surveys are 20% of folks under 30 think that the Holocaust was a hoax or made up or great, and 25 or 30% think that it was greatly exaggerated. And you get very large numbers, 44 some odd percent, or think that too much is made of it, because they've gone through, going back to that picture of the students in the classroom. If a professor told me something when I was that age, I too more or less took it in. I was taught some things about, and I talk about it in the book, I was taught things about Heidelberg that were, basically false. But if my professor said it, really, what did I have to argue with him? I'm there to learn, and I'm assuming that he's or she is a vetted professor. It's not like students really these days have, I am unfortunately to say, TikTok and other social media have made it even more difficult for students to disbelieve their professors. So this has now become mainstream. And you have arenas like ESG, environmental social governance, where investing is done through a screen of social justice. And people involved with that, even though 5%, 10% think of think that BDS is important in investing. It's probably closer to 5% by surveys. Uh, the folks who have passed through these classes have essentially taken over some of those ESG arenas at the base level. And so for one ESG provider that we talked about, even though there's other conflicts in the world, something like 70+% of all of what they wrote about having to do with conflict areas related to Israel and Palestine. You know, we have other issues in the world, unfortunately. There are 7 billion-ish people in the world. Maybe we've passed 8. And there's unfortunately plenty of conflict areas in the world. There's, as you can hear, and you'll hear from Shale Horowitz, there's about 97 active conflict areas. But 77% of all conflict areas passed by this, as I wrote in this article, as I wrote in an article, A Smear by Any Other Name, that's on my website, and in other places. It's all about Israel. Why? Because if you're in the conspiracy theory, it's very hard to get out. So I don't think it's actually going to be possible to get most people out of conspiracy theories. As a matter of fact, Javen Bryford and Quassam, who are two of the leading academics who have studied conspiracy theories, both think you can't get people out of conspiracy theories. And they, by the way, are very surprised when they did their research that so many conspiracy theories seem to relate to Jews. Maybe that's because so many people are politically motivated to create anti-Jewish theories of one sort or another. So what are we to do about it? And that is, I think we really have to get back to super duper fundamentals. We have to go to getting back at truth and evidence, because frankly, I think many Jews have been surprised by how few allies we have. It's fewer than we would like. Extremely few in the academic world. And the way we get back to being protected is, the Talmud says the seal of God is truth, emet. Emet being Aleph, the first letter, Mem being the middle letter of the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, and Tet being the final letter. You've got to cover it all. And so I think by getting back, and my goal in writing Conspiracy U and in the conclusions that I write is getting back to evidence-based theories. And I think if we do that, I think we'll be in a much better situation in society. I think conspiracy theories, they're really bad for the Jews, but they're just as bad for all of societies. We happen to be the canary in the coal mine. So that's what I wanted to present to you. I understand we have some questions in the queue. And I'd be happy to talk to them. I'd be happy to expand or touch on other things. If those of you who read the book want to ask me about other stuff, that's also good. So I'm going to pass it to Nina, and you can go from the Q&A.
Hi, I'm Nina Walden, and now is your opportunity to ask Scott Shay questions about this interesting thing that he's been telling us. So just type them into the Q&A and I will relate them to Scott. And I'm going to start with the first one. We have some great questions. Where do you think anti-Israel conspiracy theories on campus are originating? Old anti-Semitism, intersectionality with other progressive movements, lack of understanding, history, or other?
So I think the origination, again, is people who know what they're doing. I mean, I think Jasper Puar knows what she's doing. She essentially says that. She's trying to get people aligned with the violent overthrow of Israel and the destruction of Israel. It's part and parcel by the river to sea. So the origination, I think, is people who really hate Israel, want it destroyed. And the means, if you will, are these conspiracy theories about Jews. I read about in the book, the best way to control someone is through their ethos, is to make people believe that unless you think Israel is terrible, well, you're an evil person. And that's interestingly in the chants, shame on you, and all of that. I mean, chants that are going up the Upper East Side. That's how actually you get a group of people standing in front of Memorial Sloan Kettering, cancer patients, cancer doctors, cancer nurses, people who are taking care of loved ones and are grieving for loved ones. That's how you get people yelling that Memorial Sloan Kettering is complicit, because the facts actually don't matter. I mean, it's very interesting. And I was one of the people that when a few weeks ago when 3 Palestinian young men were shot at, the president spoke about it. It became a national issue. It turns out they were shot at, but the person who shot at them was very pro-Hamas, very anti-Israel. So the facts don't matter. So it wasn't a hate crime. The facts simply don't matter. Now, that's been inculcated for a long time on campus, and I can't give the answer totally now, because what I show in the book is that this has been part of a plan since the 70s. Not a plan that's been, with one architect, but a lot of people working in the same direction. And places like Qatar that have given $600 million to Northwestern and also owns Al Jazeera. It's no coincidence that the only partnership that Northwestern has with the news agency is with Al Jazeera. And you can find it on the Qatar campus website. I'm sure Northwestern wouldn't make a partnership with NBC or CNN or MSNBC or Fox. They wouldn't do it with anybody with an opinion, but they wouldn't do with Al Jazeera. So I think we have to give the enemies of Israel a lot of credit. They thought about where can they be most effective, and the place to start is campus. And the theories could be different. And I just want to make one last point. The Marx would have laughed at the religious anti-Semitism that preceded him, because he propagated the economic anti-Semitism. He wouldn't have understood Hitler's and the far right's racial anti-Semitism. And none of them would have really totally understood anti-Zionism. But they're all a way, and Rabbi Sachs wrote about this, may rest in Zichrono Levarcha, they're all a way of expressing anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred in current terms. So it becomes oppressor, oppressed. Whatever the current language is, that's what's used for Jew hatred.
Well, this question that I'm about to ask you kind of follows up with what you just said. In the light of the First Amendment protection, what can a university like Northwestern do to address the virulent conspiracy theories propagated by professors?
Hold them to academic standards. That's what we need to do. I mean, the issue is not that people can't say whatever they want to say. They can say whatever they want to say. This is a free country, and I would defend that right. But they can't make stuff up under the name of being a professor. They can't and shouldn't do. That's not academic standards, and that you can be removed from. And by the way, also making Jewish students cower in a library while they're being thrown, while the doors are being beaten, having rocks thrown. When ASU was holding a BDS resolution, rocks were thrown at the windows outside. In Cornell, students were literally threatened at their cafeteria, at the kosher cafeteria in the dorm near the Hillel. No, that you have to do, and frankly, that's not about context. That's about really, truly not making people feel safe or unsafe because you're using, you're using um, some language, or you're not using the correct pronoun, all of which you might agree upon, but actually physically threatening them. That's unsafe. That's non-safety. And that university, if they can't do that, then we as a Jewish community need to think about where we can send our children.
We have two questions here that relate to that. One of them is, how can parents try to find colleges or universities that are less immersed in this anti-Jewish conspiracy thinking? And I'm going to give you the next question at the same time because they relate. How can we help equip Jewish students with the tools to identify and combat anti-Semitism on campus when they come across it? So they're two different questions, but they're related.
So in a way, they fit together very well, because I tell students, I've had a lot of students who I've talked to, who, there was one student, and I said this on, where a question, this was at, well, I don't want to go into the university, but this is a well-known university. And one of the questions was, actually, University of Massachusetts. I don't know, there's no reason not to talk about it. One of the questions was on an exam, asking the question, and then there were 5 answers. It was a multiple choice. One of them was, Israel is an apartheid state. If you didn't answer that question correct, as Israel is an apartheid state, you would be marked wrong, even though it's a lie, and your grade would be lower. And I told a student who told me this about this. I said, you know what? You should check Israel's an apartheid state, because you're there to get a grade and a degree. You're not there to make, to mark yourself down. Why? Get your degree, get out of there. The place where there's anti-Semitism and where we need to fight it is at the top of the stream, not at the bottom of the stream, which is the professors who are self-selecting themselves for anti-Jewish views. So at the anthropology department at Northwestern, if there's the slightest hint that you're not anti-Israel, you're not going to get accepted into grad school there. You're certainly not going to have to be a professor. You're certainly not going to get on a tenure track. You're certainly not going to get anywhere. You're off, forget about it. So what we need to do is focus on the universities, focus on the trustees. The universities and equipping the students is important, but what they really are there to do is to get their degree and get out, because in 4 years, they're not going to persuade anybody. They're certainly not going to persuade professors, and professors have a huge amount of power over them. Now, where are universities that are a little better? Well, I would go to the letter that was authored by President Rabbi Ari Berman at Yeshiva University. He got about 100 universities, 100 colleges and universities to sign it as well. Unfortunately, very few of the fancy universities, if any, I think none, signed the letter. And the places that I recommend, I'm hesitant to even do it online, because the places I can recommend are getting fewer and fewer. I do think Brandeis is a good place to go. And a lot of the universities that signed the letter, where they're not out and out anti-Semitic, are in many cases Christian universities, and places that Jewish students may not feel comfortable going to. I have been recommending to people to consider Reichman University in Israel. It's got a 3-year English degree program, but it's very difficult, and I wish I had a better answer to where to go to school. I really, really do.
Here's something related to someone who has been applying to jobs as a professor. He says, is it at all possible for an observant Jewish academic to overcome the anti-Jewish sentiment in general academia, or is he just to not be a professor?
So I know, and I've spoken with throughout this since before and since the publication of the book, observant Jewish professors. And yes, in some departments, in some universities, you can. I mean, but I also know I know of two observant professors who were there were complaints about them. Right now, there were complaints, not right now, but in the last weeks, complaints about them from students. And they've been, in one case, the professor has tenure and, but he's still been put on some sort of probationary, supervision. Having said that, there are universities, there are departments where it's okay, but it's not so easy, and it depends on the topic. For example, in the humanities, it's much tougher. In the sciences, it's not as bad. The hard sciences are better. The humanities are the worst, and the social sciences somewhere in the middle. So it'll depend on the department.
Thank you. And here's another question. How can African Americans who are pro-Israel form communities to help evidence-based information to help teach evidence-based information about Jews? So
Well,
where they can get the facts.
yeah, I think that the Black community has been historically, very close to the Jewish community. I talk a little bit about it in the book, and I talk about my own parents' experience and how they raised me to be colorblind. Now we have a hyper focus on race, but certainly my parents taught me to be totally colorblind and to judge everyone according to their character. I don't know if they didn't use that word. They didn't quote Martin Luther King, but they were definitely devotees of Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King. And so I think there's a natural affinity. And there are Black Jewish groups. I can't quote them off the top, but they do exist. I know that APAC definitely has a significant number of Black Americans who are members, and they definitely do outreach. So does ADL. So do many Jewish community relations councils in cities across America. So I encourage that, and I think we need allies. We desperately need allies now, and the Black community is a natural ally to us, and we should be natural allies to the Black community.
I agree. And thank you. It's 7:55. So we have maybe time for one more question, but it's more like an observation. And I can maybe put some of them together. This person said, I think having people like Amy Goodman in Democracy Now! Giving platform only to Palestinians is dangerous, especially because she was born Jewish. And I think this person is alluding to several Jewish people in the spotlight who are, being not being our friend.
Oh yeah, I mean, we had one photo that I didn't use tonight that I was going to because I didn't have the time, but Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein and you have a lot of people, and it really hurts me when people start, they say, as a Jew, as a rabbi. Well, it's very disconcerting. And look, I don't hold it. If someone's Jewish and doesn't want to be part of the Jewish community, that's okay. But that doesn't mean that they speak for the 90-ish% of the Jews who do. And but folks like Norman Finkelstein, who's appearing on the screen, claim to, and there's a whole bunch of people who claim to, and survey after survey says that's just really not true. And we've been praying for the promised land for many years. We are the indigenous people. There's plenty of archaeology that takes us back at least to about 1200 BCE. Certainly past 1000. There's plentiful archaeology, and if you don't want to be in Vienna, something like half of the Jews converted in the 1920s. So there are people. There's when there's it's not a good time to be Jewish from the perspective of the rest of the world. And it does lead people to leave. And in academia, if you want to succeed, you almost have to, if you're Jewish more than otherwise, you have to pound your chest with your anti-Zionist credentials. So there's a lot of pressure on people to do it. And then sometimes people give into cognitive dissonance, or they want cognitive consonance. So on that note, I want to not leave everyone in despair. I want to say, look, my father was a Holocaust survivor. We Jews have been through a lot in history. And one thing we don't do is despair. We figure out how to move forward. And that's what we have to do now. And our battle right now is so important because it's not just about us. It's about Western civilization, and it's about the West, and it's about liberal values surviving. So on that note, I want to encourage everybody to get involved. There's lots of ways. I'm glad we had the question from the African American community, but everybody needs to get involved. This is not something where you can look back and say, oh, I didn't pay attention, because we may be at a pivot point for the Jews in America and for America, and certainly for academia. And thank you, Nina, and thank you, Audrey, and thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Scott, for that sobering but also illuminating talk. I just want to let everybody know that our next Scholar Circle lecture will feature Professor Shay Horowitz, Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The topic is How Israel Compares, Why Fair-Minded People Should Support Israel, and Why Scapegoating Israel is Genocidal Anti-Semitism. On that note, thank you, everyone, and have a good evening. And we'll see you hopefully on January 31st for that lecture from Shay Horowitz at 7 p.m., January 31st, at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you again, Scott. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.